Downing Street insisted plans for a customs partnership with the EU are not dead today despite Boris Johnson condemning them as crazy. The Foreign Secretary brought the bitter cabinet row crashing into the open with a dramatic intervention in which he warned that the proposal would create a whole new web of bureaucracy. The outspoken attack, in an interview with the Daily Mail, raises the prospect that Mr. Johnson could quit if Mrs. May does not drop the idea. But the issue of Brexit was not raised at all at a cabinet meeting today. The PM spokesman said officials were currently working as a priority on the customs union idea and the maximum facilitation option favoured by Brexiteers. The spokesman pointed out that Mr. Johnson had previously signed up, along with the rest of the cabinet, to considering both options. Asked whether Mrs. May had urged ministers to carry out their discussions in private, the spokesman said, "Not in cabinet, no." No10 said the PM still had full confidence in the Foreign Secretary. Cabinet sources confirmed that the issue of Brexit had not been mentioned at all at the session this morning. Amid mounting pressure on Mrs. May to find a way through the impasse, leading Tory Eurosceptic Jacob Rees-Mogg said Mr. Johnson had hit the nail on the head and also suggested Britain would be much more aggressive in negotiations with Brussels. He was PM. But there was a backlash from Tory Remainers, who raged that Mr. Johnson's stance was disgraceful and he must wake up to reality. Brexiteers fear No10 wants to rebadge the customs partnership blueprint and force it through despite heavy criticism from a powerful cabinet subcommittee last week. But Mrs. May has pushed the war cabinet showdown back from this Thursday to next week as she struggles to find a compromise solution. Under the partnership concept, officials would track shipments into the UK and collect tariffs for Brussels on goods ending up in the EU. However, in his interview Mr. Johnson said that would simply lead to more red tape. It's totally untried and would make it very, very difficult to do free trade deals, he added. If you have the new customs partnership, you have a crazy system whereby you end up collecting the tariffs on behalf of the EU at the UK frontier. If the EU decides to impose punitive tariffs on something the UK wants to bring in cheaply, there's nothing you can do. That's not taking back control of your trade policy. It's not taking back control of your laws. It's not taking back control of your borders, and it's actually not taking back control of your money either, because tariffs would get paid centrally back to Brussels. Greg Clark, the pro-Remain business secretary, insisted on Sunday that the partnership idea was far from dead and warned thousands of car industry jobs could go if Britain did not stay in some form of customs union. Within minutes of Mr. Clark talking up the plan, the pro-EU CBI and the British Chambers of Commerce issued statements backing his position. But Mr. Johnson said colleagues in cabinet have different concerns about different aspects of the argument, and it's entirely right that they should make their points. But we should be looking at the opportunities and thinking confidently about the UK and believing what we can do, rather than succumbing to a sort of Project Fear Mark 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The PM's spokesman told reporters today there are two customs models that were put forward by the government last August and most recently outlined in the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, which the entire cabinet was signed up to. Following last week's subcommittee meeting, it was agreed that there are unresolved issues in relation to both models and that further work is needed. The Prime Minister asked officials to take forward that work as a priority. Mr. Rees-Mogg raised the temperature further by suggesting Mr. Johnson would take a more aggressive approach to Brexit if he became PM, although he claimed there was no desire to replace Mrs. May. The EU knows if they don't support and help Theresa May to get a deal, there is the risk of having somebody much more aggressive, which they don't want, Rees-Mogg told The Telegraph. I think that's helping her. By being a Remainer, by being moderate, by being courteous, she is doing a highly competent job in negotiations. I don't think they would like to have Boris Johnson, do you? That's a strength of her position. Banging the table doesn't always get results. Fellow Brexiteer Bernard Jenkins said the partnership idea amounted to self-deception. I think the Prime Minister is very anxious to try to bring the whole party together around some kind of compromise proposal, and the argument is going on about this. I think in the end she will have to drop it because it will prove unworkable, he told BBC Radio 4's Today programme. I think it is a bit of an act of self-deception to say that we are leaving the customs union, but we are still going to apply the common external tariff to all the imports coming in from the EU. But Tory former Minister Baroness Altman said the intervention by Mr. Johnson was disgraceful and the UK needed to wake up to reality. We need to stay in CU and EA to ensure future success, she wrote on Twitter. Conservative former Attorney General Dominic Grieve said Mr. Johnson's decision to speak out was regrettable, but said he could understand why Mrs. May was willing to put up with his outbursts. Mr. Grieve told BBC Radio 4's World at 1, I have an old-fashioned view of what cabinet responsibility entails, which is that the discussions within government on any given matter are confidential until the time is reached that the government has a collective decision. At that stage, if you don't like the collective decision you have to resign. I don't think he is in any way inhibited by normal propriety in government. I can well understand that seeing the difficult issues that we are having to confront, which are very divisive, the Prime Minister should accept these rather extraordinary bursts of misbehavior by Boris. Mr. Johnson made his comments in an interview with the Daily Mail during a two-day visit to Washington, D.C. He hailed the massive opportunity of a U.S. trade deal and said a rich and deep agreement could be reached only after a clean break from the EU. You can't do that if you remain locked in the lunar pull of Brussels, the tractor beam of Brussels, he said. There's a discussion going on, and we haven't resolved this, but some of the ideas would make it very difficult for us to do meaningful free trade deals. On Northern Ireland, he said that if Britain chose to change its laws on imported goods or foods, as is often required under trade deals, that would inevitably mean checks at the border. It only solves the Northern Ireland border question if you force companies to prove that an imported tariff-reduced good has been consumed in the UK, and if you insist on complete regulatory alignment with the EU rule book, he said. Otherwise, if Britain chose to vary its laws in any way at all on goods and agri-food, then logically you would need checks at the border. The Foreign Secretary warned against being locked into the EU structures. That's not what the Americans want to see. What they want to see, like all our friends, is a confident free trading Britain able to do its own deals. A senior White House source said last night that Donald Trump was determined to do a great trade deal with Britain. The source also said the US president was looking forward to coming to the UK in July, but signaled some nervousness about possible protests. The president is keen for Britain to get out of the EU so we can get on with doing a great trade deal. He's surprised it's taking so long, the source said. He is looking forward to coming over, and he wants people to be positive about that. Mr. Johnson warned that opponents of Mr. Trump's visit risk damaging the economy. Overwhelmingly, the people of the United Kingdom will want to hear from the President of the United States, he said. America is our number one export market. Trade with America is worth $100 billion a year. There are 1 million people in the US employed in British firms, just as there are 1 million people in the UK employed in American firms. In January, Mr. Trump repeated his determination to secure a US-UK trade deal, saying, "As you know, you are somewhat restricted because of Brexit, but when that restriction is up, we're going to be your great trading partner." Mr. Johnson has made a series of pointed and carefully timed interventions in the Brexit debate since entering government, often to the dismay of Downing Street. In September last year, before a major speech by Theresa May in Florence, he wrote a 4,000-word Brexit manifesto that prompted accusations of backseat driving. What are the options on the table for a customs deal with the EU? With time ticking away on the Brexit negotiations, the cabinet is still at daggers drawn on the shape for future trade relations with the EU. The government has set out two potential options for a customs system after the UK leaves the bloc. But despite a series of tense showdowns at Theresa May's Brexit war, cabinet ministers continued to be deadlocked over what to do. Meanwhile, Brussels has dismissed both the ideas and warned that negotiations could stall altogether unless there is progress by a key summit next month. Under the so-called hybrid model, the UK would collect EU import tariffs on behalf of Brussels. Britain would be responsible for tracking the origin and final destination of goods coming into the country from outside the EU. The government would also have to ensure all products meet the bloc standards. Firms selling directly into the UK market would pay the tariff levels set by Brussels, but would then get a rebate if Britain's tariffs are lower. Supporters of the hybrid plan in Cabinet, including Theresa May, Philip Hammond and Greg Clark, say keeping duties aligned up front would avoid the need for physical customs borders between the UK and EU. As a result, it could solve the thorny issue over creating a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Mrs May has been advised by the Chief Whip that the hybrid option could be the only way of securing a majority in Parliament for a Brexit deal. But Brexiteers regard the proposal as unworkable and cumbersome, and they were joined by Sajid Javid and Gavin Williamson in criticising it at a tense war cabinet meeting last week. There are fears the experimental system will either collapse and cause chaos or prevent the UK from being able to negotiate free trade deals around the world after Brexit. Mrs May has instructed officials to go away and revise the ideas. Eurosceptics are braced for her to bring back the plan with only cosmetic changes and try to peel off Mr Javid and Mr Williamson from the core group of Brexiteers. They are also ready for Mrs May to attempt to bypass the war cabinet altogether and put the issue before the whole cabinet, where she has more allies. The MaxFac option accepts that there will be greater friction at Britain's borders with the EU. But it would aim to minimize the issues using technology and mutual recognition. Goods could be electronically tracked and pre-cleared by tax authorities on each side. Shipping firms could also be given trusted trader status so they can move goods freely and only pay tariffs when they are delivered to the destination country. Companies would also be trusted to ensure they were meeting the relevant UK and EU standards on products. Senior ministers such as Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Liam Fox believe this is the only workable option. But Remain-minded Tories such as Mr Clark insist it will harm trade and cost jobs in the UK. They also warn that it will require more physical infrastructure on the Irish border, potentially breaching the Good Friday Agreement. It is far from clear whether the government would be able to force anything through Parliament that implied a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The EU has dismissed the idea that MaxFac could prevent checks on the Irish border as magical thinking. Brussels can't bear to see us succeed. Commentary by Ian Duncan Smith. At the EU referendum almost 2 years ago, the British people heroically saw through Project Fear. In their determination to embrace national independence, they refused to be intimidated by the deceitful scaremongering about our supposedly apocalyptic future after Brexit. Yet the establishment has never accepted the democratic verdict of the electorate. Unable to imagine life without the EU's rule, devoid of any real faith in Britain's capabilities, key elements of the political class have embarked on a systematic campaign to obstruct and emasculate Brexit. That relentless hostility shown through most recently in debates in the House of Lords, where unelected, unaccountable peers lined up to sneer at the public's wish for national freedom. Too much of this spirit of fearfulness and surrender has infused our side in the negotiations with the EU over withdrawal, leading to a catalogue of concessions in return for little. In the same vein, the civil service, those past masters at delay, keep pushing for an ever longer transition period in the hope that institutional inertia may ultimately thwart Britain's departure. Now the establishment is refusing to let go of its new weapon, the customs union. Over the weekend, Business Secretary Greg Clark told the BBC that the Theresa May's proposed new customs partnership, a fudged version of the customs union that was rejected by her Brexit cabinet only last week, remained on the table. An arrangement of this kind is necessary, he declared, otherwise the British economy will suffer and trade will shrink. Gazing into his crystal ball, Clark specifically warned that 3,500 car jobs at Toyota could be at risk without the customs deal. Whether intentional or not, these comments echo the same old soundtrack of alarm that always accompanies calls for submission to Brussels. But Project Fear did not work in 2016, and it will not work now. That is partly because, as has been well rehearsed in recent days, the new customs partnership would create a bureaucratic nightmare, hurt our economic prospects, hit our global trade and undermine our democracy. The jewel in the crown of Brexit will be the ability to reach our own trade deals around the world, particularly with the fast-developing nations of Asia, something that Brussels simply cannot stomach. In their efforts to hype concerns about Brexit and be as obstructive as possible, EU officials, Dublin and the pro-EU brigade here talk endlessly about the difficulty of the Irish border. In reality, the Irish question has been cynically seized upon and weaponized by fear-mongering Remainers who hope to cajole us into staying put. No one actually wants a hard border. As John Thompson, the head of the HMRC, has made clear, with goodwill and imagination, the problem is easily resolvable, especially since Britain and Ireland have operated a common travel area since 1923. Indeed, the whole question of a customs arrangement with the EU has been grossly exaggerated by the Remain lobby. Only about 12% of Britain's GDP involves exports to the EU, while just 8% of British companies trade with the EU. Most of our economy is based on the domestic market, which suffers from Brussels' protectionist policies that push up prices and increase burdens on businesses. Freed from the dead hand of Brussels, consumer costs, especially of food, will fall and enterprise will flourish. It is absurd to cling to the idea, eagerly peddled by the anti-Brexiteers, that the EU is some kind of engine of economic growth. Just the opposite is true. EU officialdom is the enemy of jobs and innovation, as is reflected in its cripplingly high rates of unemployment, especially among young people, in EU countries like Spain and Greece. And EU-led stagnation is bound to worsen in the coming years as Brussels presses ahead with its cherished ideological project of further political integration. That will mean more taxation in the name of harmonization, more regulation, more centralized governance, more streams of directives. Britain will have to be part of that if we end up in a customs union. Brexit gives us the chance to break free from the continuing destruction of our sovereignty. That is what the British public recognized in 2016. Tragically, however, the establishment, reflected in its doom-mongering asides, remains mired in timid defeatism, reluctant either to challenge the EU or contemplate change.